So welcome back. It was good to go through all of the groups. Some of the groups were fully staffed. Some of the groups were small, only two or three students. But honestly, it didn't seem to impact your pace, which I love. I love the spirit, and I know
Yeah,
that
we can see.
I know that you all have made your choices around your stakeholder groups. In the interest of time, I'll just jump into what I want to cover didactically today. But whatever group you've chosen, everything we do from now on should be focused on that group, whichever stakeholder group that you focus on. Some of you picked contract workers, which is a very inspired choice, I thought. Some of you picked doctors and healthcare workers, which in general people will not think of underserved, but in this crisis, they are underserved, even in the US. Some of you picked migrant workers,
Mm.
seniors living alone, remarkable choices. And what I was amazed was that there was not a lot of no two groups had identical groups that you chosen. It's okay if you do choose groups that are identical. That's perfectly fine. If all nine of you had chosen the exact same group, I would have been okay with that. But I love the diversity, which is awesome. Everything you do, the stakeholder groups that you identify, the contact information for those groups, and the kinds of questions you can ask them should be focused on that. And today, what we're going to talk about the rest of the session is needs finding, the very first step. Once you've picked it, we know our topic that it's a impact of COVID-19 on an underserved community. That's the topic area, and then we have picked a population. Now it's all about how do we go about doing needs finding. And some of you had very good questions about how are we going to approach them, how are we going to find out, and what if a lot is already known. Trust me, a lot is not already known. When you start digging into it, a lot of unmet needs will come out that nobody would have an idea about. Most government agencies, most some of the NGOs maybe, rural communities themselves would have, but you're trying to do this in a very structured fashion. Purpose of module 1 was to teach you this methodology and get you to a point where you identified unmet needs, you prioritized them, you got to one need, and have some concepts or some ideas around how to solve those. That was going to be module 1. And module 2 was going to be you then starting to dive deeper into the concepts and then a prototype and test and get to a concept by the end of module 2 that you want to drive through as a final solution. So there is a solution at the end of these two modules, but not all of you may want to go to module 2 because module 2 is a lot of work, hundreds of hours of work. But at least in the module 1, you would learn how to identify unmet needs and come up with potential solutions to them. So that's the purpose of module 1, which is 4 weeks, 10 hours of didactic session and a few hours of work in between every week. So fundamentals of needs finding, there are really three main components of a need, three dimensions of a need. What is the problem? Who is facing this problem? And what is the outcome that you want to come to if you solve that problem? Let me repeat. Problem, population, outcomes. So actually, let me see if I have a need statement here. I don't have a need statement here, but I showed that last time when we presented, where the need statement was there's a need to have a on-the-field diagnostic. Actually, let's just take a COVID-19 unmet need. There's a need for on-the-field diagnostic test for the migrant workers. For a quick, inexpensive, high precision, high accuracy diagnostic test for the migrant population, so that health officials can quickly identify which patients, which migrant workers should be isolated and treated, or something like that. So, I just spoke to a need statement that included the problem, the population, and the outcome that you are looking for. That's what you're ultimately trying to get to, okay? And the way you get that is first you make observations and you convert them into need statements and then articulate them in the fashion that we talked about. So how do you do that? How do you sort of start need exploration? There are several different ways, and one of the ways is you already started that. Actually, you already started doing that. Background research. Do lots of background research. Clinical papers, news reports, YouTube videos, social media, but also reports put out by the government, for example, right, or NGOs. All of that is background research. Do as thorough a background research as possible. And that continues, by the way, that continues throughout your needs finding. Second is interviews, and I'm going to reorder that. Interviews with the group that you're targeting, the migrant workers in this case, for example, or health workers or whatever, but also stakeholders that engage with that group. So migrant workers, if there are village panchayats we talked about, right? Maybe village panchayat officials, health workers who are in the primary healthcare center that these migrant workers go to in their communities, state government officials who move these migrant workers, right? So all of those folks are stakeholders, and you interview them, or you can do surveys if it's a very large group and you want quantitative data. So that's a surveys/interviews is a second observation technique, and the third one are actually on the ground observation, you being there with them. That's probably the most effective of the observation techniques or needs exploration techniques. Unfortunately, during COVID-19, you probably won't be able to do it. So a big part of this is going to be missing. But I want to share this with you because when the times open up and you're going to deploy this methodology in a much more rigorous way, that's something that you should keep in mind. And by the way, if you're not able to do the observation, if you can get a proxy of yours to go do that observation, like an NGO that's already working in the field, you just kind of make a partner out of that NGO individual. That could be one way to do it as well, or the village panchayat person. Here are the rules of observations. When you're doing observation, there are some very important things, whether you're doing it through the calls or even when you're watching a video. And really important is to not to judge. Don't make judgments about, for example, in the US, there's half the population doesn't wear a mask. Okay, this is the population that voted for Trump, right? If I'm doing needs finding in that group that's suffering inordinately in terms of infections and so on, or the youth in the US, right, that doesn't like to wear masks, I'm not going to judge them for saying, oh, what careless behavior on their part. But the moment you do that, you're starting to bias your observation. So keep your judgment aside. Be a truly dispassionate, unbiased observer. So don't judge, number one. Number two, be truly curious. Don't just take what is on the surface as the final thing. Be curious about it, right? Really, really be curious about that individual, about that community, so try and be as curious about it as possible. Keep your mind open about inputs that are coming in. Be open to it, so be curious. Third is question everything. It doesn't mean that you start to raise doubts about what's being said or whatever. Question everything means don't accept the information as is. Look at other aspects of it, okay? Probe as much as you can. You see a media report, don't just take that media report as the final word. What's underneath it? Because your reporter may not have done a thorough enough job of interviewing the person, right? So you're not doubting the person, but you are trying to figure out if there's more to it. Or when the response comes back from a stakeholder in the media interview or your own interview, try to go underneath what's being said. Okay, so that's that. Fourth one is find patterns. You start, when you do, let's say there are, you've already interviewed 3, healthcare workers, and now you're on to the fourth one. You say, wait, what's health workers saying? I saw this in a video earlier, or a news report earlier, in a report earlier. And then I heard this from a couple of these nurses earlier as well, that they were not being given these, PPEs, that there's a shortage, even though in the media something else is being said, right? So you start to see the patterns, right? So find patterns. And finally, really important, listen. Really listen. Don't hear it, listen to it. So pay attention to it, incorporate it in your thinking. So often what mistakes people make, and some of the new team members in the organization that I'm part of actually do that as well, is that they typically have a questionnaire that they want to go after, and you all will have questionnaires as well. And then all they want to do is just get the answers to those questions. They just go boom, 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 in a very sort of linear fashion. That's not listening. You're not incorporating what you're hearing from them into your needs exploration, the observation. You need to weave the conversation with them. Take it where it goes. And it may not be the same questions that you would ask in each interview, But as long as you do enough of them, you'll be able to capture enough of everything. So listen, okay? Really listen. All right. And by the way, if you have any questions, let me actually pull up my chat window here so that you can ask me any questions that come up. Let me see if I can pull it. Sorry. Oh, there you go. I found it. My chat window is hidden, and I want to actually be able to see if any questions come up. Apologies, guys. Yeah, because I want to be able to respond to your questions as they come up. Okay, you get it. Awesome. Just go to the. Okay. All right. So what are the important clues? So as you're doing observations, so we talked about how there are these important rules to follow when you're doing observation. Now, what are the important clues when you're doing observation? When you're doing interviews, when you're observing as a fly on the wall, you're in that bus where migrant workers were being shipped around, or you were on the walk with them, or you're in the isolation ward with a healthcare worker mentally, right? Mentally. What are the clues that you should be looking for? Depends on the stakeholder group. So here's some example. And by the way, the list is much larger, but there's some examples. So if it's a patient or the family that you're focused on, patient or the target population that we're talking about, patient because of the healthcare workers. Most of this methodology that I apply is for healthcare needs, but this can be applied to any needs, right? So the stakeholder, the primary target population that you're looking at, or their family members, you should really be looking at what pain or complications or stress or challenges that they face. So when they're expressing it in their body language, in the words, they will actually give you clues, basically. If you're talking to folks that are providing care to them, whether it's village mentat or it's healthcare workers or whatever, you're really looking at comments from them about, oh, we don't really know what's going to happen. So if, let's say you're focusing on, let's say, seniors who are living in isolation, right? And a stakeholder group that you focus on is this NGO that works with them, and you ask them, and they say, we don't know how often they talk to their kids. We don't know if they have any way to talk to others other than us talking to them, bringing them food or medicine. We don't know what their current situation is. So that uncertainty should give you a cue. It should be a clue that there is a problem, there's a challenge, that maybe there's a mental isolation, there's emotional isolation. That could identify an unmet need area. Okay, and just look at information gap, look at cost of something, look at inefficiency in whatever is being done. So, for example, somebody brought up earlier in the chat, somebody not being able to find a bed for some other condition they may have, not COVID-19 disease, but some other condition they may have. I'll give you an example of stroke for this grandma, right? So the inefficiency in the healthcare system, or whatever system you're talking about, in addressing this this group, the stakeholder group or this target group, could be a clue as well. So there are a lot of different clues that you can use to start to look at the gaps or unmet needs. Okay. Feel free to ask me any questions, by the way, as we are going through. There are certain rules that you should follow, a must do, that when you're doing the observation, whether you're doing interview or whether you're doing a fly on the wall kind of observation, in-person immersion. Definitely write down when, at what time, and where you did this. In this case, if you're doing a phone call, then it's a phone call. But you should identify where the person is, which part of the world, which part of the country, which city, which town, home, outside, whatever, right? If it's a farmer, maybe the farmer was in the field when he or she talked to you, right? You should also identify what their context is, what their surrounding is, who else was present, and so on. Look at any facts, make notes of very specific facts, numbers, details, because they are cues. They are very important clues about, the size of the problem. So they may say, साहब हमको तो 2,000 रुपया खर्चा हो गया, तनख्वाह तो आ नहीं रही है. So right there, that gives you a number, an economic impact on them. Those numbers can be very, very important. The facts can be very important. So 12 दिन लगा वहां से वहां तक आने के लिए. So that's another, right? So pay attention to the specific facts and data that they share. That's a highly valuable thing. Okay. The third thing, the fourth thing is look at the sensory responses. What sounds they make, the size, the body gestures. Of course, you're not going to be physically there, so you can't do the smell because depending on what's going on in a healthcare setting, that could be an issue. So the last two don't apply for you guys here. Look at the reactions to the observations. When you hear something from a stakeholder, you repeat back to them, "Acha, aisa hua," and then you hear back their responses. They may go a little deeper into it, and then they kind of go further into it, right? So look at their reactions. Or nahi. So if you get a little bit of a reaction from them by rephrasing or reiterating what they have said, but very important, don't put your ideas in their head. Don't go with your assumptions. Don't put your ideas in their head. That's very important. Only repeat what they have said or what you understood what they have said. Okay. Write down specific quotes. They can be super powerful. Specific quotes that they may not just the numbers and facts, but also specific quotes. Look at timing of various steps and any questions that emerge in your mind. Write that down. Write those down. Whether you ask them or not, write those down in your notes. So note taking is a really important skill when you're doing the observations. Okay. All right. Guideline for the interviews. When you're doing the interviews, depending on who you're doing interviews with, always have a follow-on question to why. Okay. Whenever they say something, you should ask yourself or ask them about why. Kyun aisa hua? Kya hua? Aisa kyun hua? Typically, when you ask the stakeholder questions, don't ask about generally. Generally, what happens to you're talking to an NGO. So generally, what happens to these farmers in the village? Don't ask general questions. Ask very specifically targeted questions like, give us an instance of a particular farmer that you engaged in and that story about that. Or what happened when was the last time you met a farmer and what was your conversation like? Or what did you hear from that particular farmer? So have your stakeholder that you are doing the interview with, have them be placed in a particular place, particular time, so that their retelling of that is not an averaged information, because averages hide the unmet needs. Okay. 1 second, guys. Just give me 1 second. My 3.5-year-old has just woken up, and I just need to tell my wife that he has woken up. My apologies. Just give me a second. Please. कैसे करते थे वो? तो रोकते हैं. Sorry about that. Let me see. Okay, so we were. Where were we? I'm sorry, I got a little distracted there. So basically, ask a question with specific instances. I think that's where we were. Third one is encourage stories. I think stories have a lot of insight that you miss out on if you're just taking a synthesized version or distilled version of what the gap may be. If you ask them, what do you think are the problems? They're gonna list out what the problems are. But what you want really is a story about that challenge, because that story has a lot more insight. I'm sorry, I think he woke up. He usually likes me around when he wakes up. My apologies, guys. The fourth one is look for inconsistencies. You heard something somewhere from one stakeholder, then you heard from another stakeholder. You look for inconsistencies there, because that can hide an unmet need. Look at nonverbal cues. We talked about that before. This is one challenge that I often see. The next one, often see when people are doing the interviews, they like to fill in the silence because silence is uncomfortable. They try to prompt and they try to code. It's important to move the interview along, but sometimes the silence is very telling. So if there's a silence, if there's a bit of an awkward silence, it's okay. Let the silence persist for just a little bit, a few seconds, 10 seconds, 15 seconds, whatever, and then ask the question. Because sometimes from silence could come a reflection from them that you would not have anticipated, that you didn't ask about. And very important, don't prompt answers. Do not prompt answers. Sometimes we may want to, just because we want to have a conversation, we fill in what they're saying. You can have supportive noise or something, but don't prompt an answer because then you're feeding your ideas to the interview. And lastly is don't ask binary questions. Don't ask yes no questions. Generally asking a bit of an open-ended question is good. So I think that really captures the main guidelines for the interviews. Don't ask binary questions. Don't ask yes no questions. Don't give them two options to pick from. It might be easier. It might be tempting to do that, but it's a good idea. For what you're really trying to extract from them is more narrative, more stories, more examples. The more you get that, the higher would be the quality of your observations. Okay. Okay. I'm going to skip this. Value consideration doesn't quite apply for our situation. And I'm going to talk a little bit about this, about how do you prepare to engage stakeholders. So hopefully in your sessions, breakout sessions, you identified not only the underserved group that you want to focus on, but what their stakeholders look like. So have a stakeholder map, maybe with arrows showing where the information moving, where's the what sort of influence do these stakeholders have on their lives. Map that out, but start to prepare to have a conversation with them. First of all, find contact information of the groups or the individuals that you can reach out to. Hard task. This is probably one of the hardest tasks you're going to have. And then start to think about what questions you're going to ask them. Start to put together an interview guide, if you will. Some of these things may not apply because you're not going to a healthcare setting. The last one, for example, HIPAA training, that applies for the US, when India has its own version of privacy guidelines. Most folks don't follow that. So, ideally, if you have that, if you're going to a hospital setting, you want to follow that. But definitely understand your stakeholders that you're going to interview, what their background is, what is the work that they do, what's their role in the challenges that your primary underserved group that you're focused on faces. Do your background research so that your conversation with them is a lot deeper, a lot more meaningful. You should know as much about that stakeholder as you can beforehand, so that they're not asking some basic questions. On the other hand, if you have no information at all, basic questions is what you may have to ask early on. Okay. I think I'm going to skip the class interviews because we probably won't be able to do that in such a short session. So let me talk about what I would like you guys to do before our next session. And feel free to add me to your Google Docs. I already shared with you my email address. I can weigh in there based on what's happening. And your TAs would also be able to weigh in on this. But continue your secondary research now that you've identified your stakeholder, your underserved group. Finalize which stakeholders you want to meet, visit, interview. Visit probably is out of question right now. It could be NGOs, it could be healthcare experts, it could be village panchayat leaders, it could be state government officials. But if you can find contact information of the underserved community itself, that's probably the hardest. But if you can do that, that would be awesome. And then secure those interviews with those stakeholders, and then plan a sequence of conversation that you want to have with them. Okay. So I'm going to stay there for a minute, and I want to see if there are any questions. I actually, this is right on time. We finished on time, but I want to make sure that I give you guys a chance to ask any questions before we end the session. I know this was a very dense session. We moved through quickly. I normally spend much more time going through the examples of these, but I think you get the gist of it. Any questions that you have as to how you would do the needs finding? And I think many of you will likely focus on healthcare needs, but you don't have to focus on healthcare needs. You're learning this methodology for broader needs finding. But I think where I can help you all the most is on the healthcare needs, because that's my area of expertise. But you don't have to focus on that. Any questions? You can type in the chat window if you need. Okay. Adesh, Harshita, anything else that we should address before we sign off?
Yes, sir. There is one thing that I want to mention. If everybody you could join in, first log into Zoom and then use the link to join into the meet, it will be better because then breakout rooms don't need to be assigned manually.
Right. Yeah, I think that you may want to send a reminder before the next session. That way,
Or
the time 5 minutes that we lost, we weren't, but it was fine actually. One thing that I realized, Adesh and Rashida, and not all the teams had all of the team members present, and then there's at least one team member that was in two different groups, so we may have to do a little bit of rationalization of that. But all the groups are actually moving along pretty well. I was pleasantly surprised to see the progress you guys are making. Some of you had made a lot more progress than the others, but all of you had made progress, which is great, which is awesome. Let me ask you, and you can all just say yes or no. Are you finding this framework, this methodology, this module useful? You can just say yes or no in the chat. Um, uh, okay, good, awesome. Yeah, if this is you, because that's the main objective. The main reason we are doing this, the main reason that Tinker's Lab and Makers Foundation has organized this, and I'm so happy to work with them to do this, is because we think this is an important tool. As you deal with the future, it doesn't matter what you end up doing, it doesn't matter what topic area, it doesn't matter what area of your work. This methodology would be a really strong, solid tool in your toolkit. So this is great. And I'm really happy to see, and that this is something useful for you. The more you put into it, the more you're going to get out of it. And all of us are here to help. Adesh, Harshita, myself, other Tinker Labs managers. We're happy to sort of engage you. And those of you who, if most of you will likely stay only with module one, and that's going to be quite a bit of learning already. But any of you that do decide to move on to module two and you're able to move on to module two, there's going to be a lot more mentorship from some experts that I'm going to bring from Stanford, from my senior fellows that were trained by me that are based in India. These are senior, very established innovators in India, and other kinds of experts that need be, especially on the healthcare side. But looking forward to this journey next, the next two sessions with you as well, and then module two after that. Thank you. Thanks for being part of it, and what a joy to be able to teach this to you all, my fellow students, fellow alma mater. Very nice to see you guys. Bye.
Thank you, sir.